Howdy of you delicious people. I am here today to say happy Halloween. And ultimately this is going to be a pre-recorded Halloween Day movie review. But there's a reasoning behind all of that. And ultimately, if you don't hear the voice coming out of this mouth very well, let's go and adjust that. Happy Halloween, everyone. Happy Halloween. So yeah, we are definitely going to go into this and do something very special for Halloween specifically. Because at the end of the day, there is one franchise of movie that ultimately, when I was a kid, scared the bejesus out of me. And now we are going back into it, reflecting on it, and finally reviewing it for Halloween. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we're gonna go through the movie Gremlins, and then we are also going to go through the Nicolas Cage movie Vampire Kiss. One of these movies scared the bejesus of me when I was a kid, and the other is just a really fun movie that at the end of the day, I would say for people to go out of their way and finally see, because it's freaking hilarious. We'll figure out which one is which. So, ultimately, let's talk about Gremlins. I have some child like stories to tell you before we get into this review. Of course, reasonably, when I was a kid, I don't know why Gremlins messed me up so bad when looking at it now, especially after watching this movie. Maybe the second one maybe much more so scared me than the first. I don't know. But yeah, Gremlins I think was the only thing that actually scared me as a kid, and now that I finally watched this movie, I think it's a movie that still holds up because it's like it has great effects, it has great aspects of just making this not only a Halloween movie, but then also a Christmas movie as well, which is kind of interesting to remember. Going into this, Going into this film, and to remember, yeah, I think, one or two stories to tell. One, I think one thing that I want to do is try as much as possible to see the movies that I would close my eyes at the time when I was a kid and wouldn't watch. Like the original Pet Cemetery, I think I never saw like the entire movie of because I think I was too scared to watch it. So I think I need to eventually go through there, watch this movie, and finally say that I watched it. I don't think that it needs to be one of those that I need to like do an actual holiday for or whatever, but it might just be something that I go into. Because I ultimately had done the remake Pet Cemetery movie, but that's different. And also, I don't think that I ever really completely saw the original Child's Play movies. Because ultimately, funny enough, so I go. I usually, when I was really young, I would usually watch a lot of movies with my mom. And reasonably, at one point, my mom was putting in a movie. And I was like, hey, mom, what's the movie? And she was like, hey, it's Child's Play. And I'm like, well, it sounds nice. Like, what's the movie about? And then ultimately, like, she would try to explain it to me. I wouldn't really understand. But then she's like, well, hey, you probably won't like this film. And I'm like, you know what? Let's just kind of let's see. Ultimately, like I don't remember. It was such a long time ago. I don't remember this entire story. But yeah, that movie was just like, yeah, no. It's like, nope. I don't like this film. But luckily enough, I had watched the remake of Child's Play, so like that doesn't really do anything for me. So yeah, like I think Gremlins is the only real stop to really go back on and reflect on my not only my childhood, but to ultimately have this be as a thing to ultimately go into and just say, yeah, like this is the one thing that I was a kid that for some reason just like got onto my craw. There was one time where here's another story. Here's the second story. So ultimately, I like bizarrely there for some reason they were consistently doing advertisements for Gremlins being like marathoned on some channel somewhere, and I didn't understand why. But every time this commercial seemed to come up everywhere on TV, like it would just make me so uncomfortable and so just upset. And like I was just so angry that they were showing this commercial so much because again, when I was a kid, it like this movie like freaked me out. Um but yeah, so funny enough, like well, funny enough for me when looking back on it now, but it probably scared the bejesus out of my mom. My mom went into the other room, and again the commercial came on again, and so I screamed like bloody murder. 'Cause like, oh my god, no! I don't want to see this. God, why does it keep showing up? And so it just got to the point where my mom was desperately trying to find some show on TV that wouldn't show these commercials or just pop in a movie so I would be fine. God bless her, I guess, really for that, because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's my funny story to recant her and to go back on and talk about. So I apologize for this long lead up, but let's get into these reviews because this is hopefully not going to take 2 years to review these two movies. So, Gremlins. And definitely, I had watched this entire movie. More than likely, what I'm honestly going to do, to be brutally honest, because I don't remember most of the actors' names. I do, of course, remember some of them actually as actors, but a lot of the characters' names I sadly don't remember. So I'm probably gonna have some points like look down at a actor sheet of every once in a while, going, oh, "Okay, this character," but I think most of the time I'm gonna be fine with most of this. So, uh, yeah, this is weird reviewing this movie. It is. So let's go into it. So this movie, in a very cryptic like sense, yeah, it actually is pretty fun. Looking at it now when actually watching it and actually like there's some points where um I can understand how it still messes certain kids up to this day. But when kind of looking at this, I think that this is maybe um, like there's quite a bit of fun going on with this movie, and you can really tell and that it's like yeah, it's also like there to scare you, but then it's also there to just kind of have fun. And so I'm like, you know what, hey, yeah, this movie isn't that bad. And when going into this, like it seems like Jaws in a lot of ways, and I didn't even realize that this was actually a Steven Spielberg movie. Not that ultimately I wasn't like going into it like going like, oh yeah, this Steven Spielberg movie just scared me when I was a kid and blah blah blah. No, like reasonably I was just kind of going into this and I was like, oh, hey, yeah, Steven Spielberg. Yeah, I didn't even realize this was a Steven Spielberg film. Because I guess he had done so freaking many of them that every once in a while you just like, oh, yeah, I guess this is a Steven Spielberg film. Didn't even realize it. So, going into this movie, realizing that it's a Christmas movie that is to scare people, it is quite interesting to go into this movie and very much realize the weird esh like things going on in this movie, like the like an entire like batch of gremlins all going to a movie theater to see a Disney film kind of seemed weird. To And I'm kind of really trying as much to like cryptically say stuff, but then also kind of talk about the movie a little bit to gear us up for when I actually go into spoilers. Um, to ultimately see the town like when this movie really gets going and they really start escalating how many gremlins are all over this all over the city, just either going through neighborhood to neighborhood and eventually um, via certain mechanical things attacking people. Yeah, it's just kind of like it's kind of all in good fun, and at the end of the day, it was interesting to see Kate's character, who ultimately is like there was a lot of characters seemingly that I remember from like either like Fast Times at Richmond High or 16 Candles. The guy who was like automobile, automobile, like the guy that was the guy that worked in the bank. I was like, man, there's a lot of just characters from like movies that we like know within this film. Howie Mandel doing the voice of Gizmo, like I'm just like, yeah, that's kind of weird to like realize again that Howie Mandel not only did Bobby's World, but now and also he did Gizmo. Like I'm kind of wondering how exactly he did Gizmo because Gizmo a lot of times is just like I wonder how they did like the song part of it when Gizmo would sing at some points. I don't know. It was kind of interesting to me. It was kind of also interesting seeing Corey Feldman in this movie because ultimately when looking at him, I'm like, I don't remember Corey Feldman being in this film. I don't remember him being in this film. I know he was in one of the Friday the 13th movies, but I didn't realize he was in this film because ultimately there's some stuff you quickly forget when going through a lot of this stuff. So at the end of the day, this was like another like notch on the belt to ultimately go huzzah! Like I watched another movie that at the end of the day was either so iconic that a lot of people still talk about it to this day, or ultimately like something under my belt to just say, okay, finally I watched this, and I ultimately just actually really quasi like ballparkingly just kind of enjoyed it. I actually enjoyed it because ultimately it was just like, yeah, like there's some times where you can like you could tell the like if they would have probably done it this day, it would have been like clustered with special effects stuff, and it probably would have been CGI'd and stuff like that. Um, like I wish that if they're gonna keep it, if they're gonna do, because I know they're gonna be doing a animated series of Gremlins. I hope at some point that they probably actually, if they do a live action one, it's not gonna be a CGI'd like thing. I hope they keep it with puppets. To ultimately have it be like it's gonna be like Ninja Turtles all over again. People are gonna hate the CGI like a thing, and it's gonna be like irritating for them. But who knows? Who knows what's gonna happen? So, at the end of the day, let's go into spoilers about this movie because I did a really long lead up, and this movie honestly was just kind of like fun. There was some very long stretches of them having to tell like a long lead up or build of especially Billy's father that is an inventor. Why do they have to spend so much time with Billy's father, the inventor? I just didn't quite understand that. Like I think that they were just like trying to have a lot of fun in this movie, and I think they were trying to invent some things to incorporate in this film to have fun, but the whole inventor thing was just kind of like okay, they could have had that in the beginning, and then like after that they could have just like I don't know why they ended up doing what they were doing. So let's go into spoilers about this film. At the end of the day, this movie was just fun, so let's go into a run of spoiling it. So spoiler time. It's a happy Halloween day to say spoiler time. Yeah. I don't know, it broke my momentum because I threw in the happy Halloween thing. So Gremlins. So, in the very beginning of this, we find a inventor that is looking for a gift for his son for Christmas. Weird. And so we have this guy that is kind of marketing around trying to find any store that says odd or weird end like items because this guy can't sell anybody anything seemingly, or when he does, they end up regretting it or try to sell it to somebody else. So because these inventions like maybe work like a day after like he makes it work, and then it completely uh craps out. So anyways, we have this inventor that is desperately trying to sell this wake up Swiss Army knife, or whatever you want to call it. This device that has like a toothbrush, a a like a comb, a like basically if you're traveling, this is like the perfect thing to supposedly have like a wake up Swiss Army knife, to where it's like you have like um all your regular needs all in one little small compact device. Ultimately, it seems consistently that this guy accidentally hits the toothpaste on the device, and it hits him and splashes all over his chest, and so he wipes it off. So all while going through this weird Esh like guy who has all these like dragons in the back of his store, and everything is like weird antique like things that don't make any sense. Eventually, all the while, he's this inventor is desperately trying to sell this thing, and it's not working. Ultimately, the inventor goes into finding finding a box that is making some sound, and he's like, "What is that sound?" And ultimately, the uh, the old man with like these two different eyes and this weird looking hair, and he looks weird. It's odd. He ultimately is selling this guy. He's gonna sell this guy Gizmo, and he ultimately breaks down the rules. Uh, don't put him in water. Don't feed him after midnight. And I think there might have been more rules than that. Oh, don't put him in. Don't put him in bright light, or definitely don't put him in sunlight, or he will die. So basically, if anything, if gremlins end up happening and going on, reasonably all you need to do is just wait to the very next morning, and then they would all get killed off, right? You would think. But anyways, going into this movie, we of course have this inventor. He buys Gizmo, and he's ultimately trying. The old man is desperately trying to tell this inventor, make sure you like stay to these rules. And he's like, yeah, like Um, this actually looks like a pretty neat little thing. And I don't know the name that they keep calling it. It's a hard to pronounce name. Because they don't call it Gremlins in here. They don't call that at all. They call it something else. And how they end up calling it, how they end up calling the first gremlin Gizmo, ultimately it's just because the father had come up with the name, and Gizmo kept responding to it, so he's like, okay, I'll just call it Gizmo. um, so going into this, so we have it to where the inventor goes home and is making his way home. We find out that Billy works at this bank, and consistently he has his dog come with him to this bank, and I don't understand why. We have this very old lady that is begrudgingly like the villain of Billy, because every single time she sees him, she's like, "Yeah, that dog better not attack me again, or I'm gonna find it and I'm gonna put it to sleep." And like this woman is awful, and so every time she comes to that bank, she's like, "I'm gonna find that dog and I'm gonna put it to sleep." So, so Billy is behind the counter. on doing his bank like stuff. And I don't know why Billy brings like pets to his job. It makes no sense, but I guess it is what it is. So Billy brings his dog to work, and eventually that dog jumps up to get that old lady and attack her again. We have the people that work at the bank. One of the guys that I know is from the Beverly Hills Cop movies. He was also at Fast Times at Richmond High. I don't, and he ultimately plays Brad in the movie Fast Times at Richmond High, but I don't remember what his actual name is. I think his name is Judd, or Judge. I think that's his name. Like he goes by Judge. I don't, but mood point. There's also the older guy that is comforting this grouchy lady, and he is from 16 Candles, where he's the one that brings in Duck Duck, Long Duck Dong to the 16 Candles house and asks Long Duck Dong, "Where's my automobile?" And yeah. So, anyways, interesting cast of people that I know from other random Esh like movies. So, anyways, uh, here's the thing that I forgot to mention. We have this neighbor. His name is Murray, and ultimately he is asking Billy if he's gonna send his sketches anywhere, because ultimately he wants him to be on some comic strip or to be in some comic book somewhere. And Billy mentions it's like, well, they don't do those comic strips anymore. And Murray's like, oh, really? That sucks. So, because ultimately, I think Billy was having some car trouble in the very beginning of this movie, because ultimately it's a foreign car. Anyways, mood point. Billy has it to where his dog attacks the old lady, and ultimately, like, is fearing for his life that he's probably going to lose his job. So Billy ends up, after his shift is over, he ends up going to a bar, and the guy that I said is Judge ultimately goes to Billy and tells him, "Hey, guess who is like this close to unemployment today?" And Billy was like, "God, really?" As he's like, as Billy is like sketching this like dragon-ish like monster, which was honestly pretty cool. So ultimately, the guy that I know as Judge, he's kind of mentioning how man, like you should really get your act together, Billy. Like if anything, like you should be like me, where it's like things are really going up and up for me, and all of this and all this and that. And it seems like Judge is maybe throwing some shade at Kate, but Kate's not really all that interested. So there's some lead up to this movie. I have to be brutally honest. So, anyways, we have it to where, because there's a lead up, there's a hill to eventually go into within this Gremlins movie. So, eventually, Billy goes home and has to try to make some eggs with his mother at some point, and he try every single time they try to use some invention to see if it works, like an egg machine or a thing that can crack eggs, or there's a orange juice juicer. Every time, every one of these inventions horribly fail. So, anyways, we have it to where Billy's father is home, and really a lot of times when Billy's father is home, they're making fun of his inventions. Now, like, yeah, not really quite working. It's like, what do you mean? Like it was working yesterday. It's like, yeah, that was yesterday. Anyways, so Billy's dad gives him a gift, I guess, early for Christmas, because I don't know if this is exactly Christmas and or not. Who knows? But mood point. So Billy unwraps this thing, and at first he thinks that it's like another puppy, because this home, I guess, needs another dog, I guess. So immediately when Billy unwraps his present and then opens the box, Gizmo comes popping out. Like, pa! Like, what is this? And so Billy ends up taking it upstairs, and ultimately, I guess we have Corey Feldman, who is a character called Pete, who ultimately shows up to um, look over Billy's present and ultimately see like, hey, what is this? So ultimately, going into this movie, again, uh, once Billy gets once Billy gets to get this present, ultimately his father has to kind of sit him down and tell him the rules. He's like, make sure you don't put water on it, make sure you don't eat it after midnight, and make sure you don't put it in the sunlight because it'll die. So there's a lot of times where there are bright light, and Gizmo's like, bright light, and ultimately he's like, oh, I'm sorry, and so he turns it down for Gizmo. But bizarrely, Gizmo is a character that consistently like is this like mockingbird, and he's like, and he's like bizarrely singing and this and that, and so reasonably there's frequent times within this movie where Gizmo is either like singing, or once we get to the other times when there are, let's just say, other Gizmos or other variations of Gizmo at first, and then they ultimately morph and change and turn into uh, the things that they become, gremlins. So ultimately, we have it to where Gizmo ultimately is this little songbird. And so it gets to the point to where Billy is like playing the keyboard and keys to ultimately have Gizmo ultimately sing along with these keys. So at some point, Corey Feldman and Billy, so Pete and Billy, are looking at Gizmo and trying to like go, oh, hey, yeah, this is really cool, and this and that. And so accidentally, Corey Feldman accidentally pours some water onto Gizmo, and then all of a sudden, Gizmo is popping off of his body. These little, like, at first they look like little fur balls, but then eventually they start to grow and grow into other gizmos that look almost similar to Gizmo for the most point. But when Gizmo is ultimately getting all of these other gizmos reasonably, like he's saying, oh no, and all these other like weird interesting like things, like really knowing that this is going to be bad. So when going into this movie, yeah, we ultimately have a lot more gizmos, and then Corey Feldman was asking where he could get one, because ultimately he was like, oh, I would like to get one, so hey, where did you get it? And ultimately um, Billy says it's like, oh, well, my dad got this somewhere in like Japan or whatever. So ultimately, when there are multiples of this variation of Gizmo, ultimately Corey Feldman again is asking like, well, since you have more, since you have like five of them now, like, hey, how about giving me one? And Billy's like hesitant and like, I don't know, considering you were the one that first poured water on one of them and ended up turning multiple Gizmos into this. So reasonably within this movie, we have it to where ultimately, hey, yeah, don't break the rules. Don't break the rules, guys. Don't break the rules. And of course, we just have people that are just breaking the rules, because why not? So, anyways, we have it to where Billy uh, has all these gizmos till eventually they turn into gremlins, because they will eventually eat at some point right around midnight because Billy is just realizing, oh, I don't think it's midnight yet. It doesn't matter. It's around midnight. You guy, you, Billy, Billy. So, anyways, Billy ends up taking one of the gizmos because I'm gonna keep calling them gizmos until they turn into real legitimate gremlins. And he takes one of the versions of Gizmo to a scientist that works at this school. And so he brings it to him, and he ultimately ends up showing him what happens when you pour water on him. And I'm like, God, this is like, only test this one thing. only test. Only say, hey, yeah, when I poured water in this thing, it turned into multiple. Don't do it again. You schmuck. Anyways, so you're breaking the rules. So, anyways, this doctor is ultimately just like, ooh, wow. Well, if anything, I'll have plenty of these Gizmo Ash-like characters to study. Then that's great. Ultimately, he takes blood from one of them, and ultimately, this Gizmo doesn't, of course, like that. And plus, he's leaving him in a cage and a little bird cage thing, and I'm sure he's not happy about that either. So, anyways, we get it to where ultimately we're minding all the rules, but Billy, as well as pretty much everybody, just starts breaking the rules because that's what you have to do in these movies. And so we have it to where the the scientist ultimately is not realizing the time, and I don't think he was given all the instructions or all the rules or whatever. I don't think he was. So I think he like is working late at night, and so he ultimately is gonna tell his gizmo that he's like, well, hey, I'm gonna call it a night, but he's leaving some food. Right next to this Gizmo's Eshla cage, where he's gonna drag it over to him, and then ultimately this cage is going to turn into this very much big Easter egg like thing. Billy also goes into his room, and ultimately it seems that all of the extra gizmos are all very wiry and very much antsy and everything like that. And so Billy is like, well, hey, you know what? I think that, like, it's not exactly 12 o'clock yet. It's not exactly midnight, so maybe I will just kind of give you guys some food. And so he just kind of gives them some chicken. It's like, hey, you guys want some chicken? Of course, the gizmos want the chicken. And so basically, Billy falls asleep and the gizmos eat a little bit more than what they should, and they all become like Sigourney Weaver alien like eggs to eventually hatch into actual, real, true, legitimate gremlins. And again, Gizmo's like, oh no, because it's gonna go horribly awry at some point in time, especially when you'll get the one leader, Stripe, that really does some really crappy things because that's what happens. So, pushing on forward. So, ultimately, the let's just say egg hatches into the um, scientist lab, and ultimately this gremlin ultimately takes a nibble out of this guy's hand and eventually just kills him. Like at first, like the scientist is kind of walking around and the gremlin is kind of grabbing things here and there, apples and food and stuff like that. But then eventually, once the scientist tries to give him a thing of food, he takes more than just the food. He takes his hand and kills him. So, um, the scientist was calling Billy because his gremlin had hatched. And so Billy went to go see him and saw that he was dead. So ultimately, he is now going to, one, call his mother, and then two, like, he is eventually going to go to seemingly the police station at some point. Because here's what horribly goes awry. So we end up having it to where uh, mom is in the kitchen with Dinah, or alone, really, just kind of just enjoying her day, just hoping everything's gonna go well. And Billy calls her and ultimately tells her, "Yeah, I hope that you're not home when these things hatch because yeah, they are vicious. They are yeah. Don't be at home when these things are hatching, Ma. Go away somewhere." And so immediately you have the mom that is starting to hear things and she's like, you know what, I'm going to grab a knife. And so she goes upstairs and ultimately all these things at some point have hatched. And so she goes back downstairs to start going through her home, and the gremlins are starting to eat all of her food. So immediately what she is going to do is not only get like having things thrown at her like plates and all this other crazy stuff, she is eventually starting to one by one kill these things with most of the time her husband's invention. Um, Throw one of the gremlins in the, I guess, orange juice juicer to where that thing explodes. She ends up like killing a few of them via these and this and that kind of invention. At one point, she throws one of them into the microwave and toasts him. And by golly, goodbye, Gremlin. And so, yeah, like interesting aspect of just taking all down these gremlins without actually having to use like an actual legitimate thing here and there. So eventually, we find out that the gremlin that was with the scientist that Billy had brought to the scientist was actually Stripe, which was the like the white, the one gremlin with the white spiked hair. And so what ends up happening is that Billy is trying to get to this gremlin, um, but realistically, what is happening is he is completely and utterly getting attacked at this at this shul. He's ultimately trying to get this gremlin, but really, when looking at it, like he is kind of just for the bulk of the point just outmatched for most of this because ultimately he doesn't know when the gremlin is going to pop up because ultimately the gremlin went through some ventilation shaft and ultimately Billy was trying to track it down. It just popped up somewhere, and so ultimately it got to the point to where Stripe was running away, and then eventually he landed himself into this big old pool. A big old pool. Nice one, Billy. Let's scoreboard that one up for you, Billy. Just you moron. So I'm blaming all the characters into this show, but really it's not their fault because either people didn't know any better or they were just dumb. So it ends up like it's really not their fault. And hopefully no one dislikes this because I make fun of Billy or anybody else in this movie for being dumb because it is what it is. Mistakes can happen. So anyways, Gremlin goes into this pool, and then there's this like huge like bizarrish like lime green like effect going into this pool, and I thought that it was really fun and really cool. And so Billy scrambles to the police station, and ultimately he is uh, he is telling them, "Hey, you guys are going to get busy here really soon." We ultimately have some of the other gremlins that are already starting to wreak havoc on certain neighbors' homes. There's one gremlin that goes into somebody's bulldozer and drives uh, through their house, causing an accident. Of course, with it being Murray's home, the guy that was otherwise talking to Billy earlier, and there are more and more starting of accidents within this neighborhood, and so eventually the cops are gonna get called on that. So Billy goes to the police station, and ultimately, at first, they are really thinking that it's all some kind of prank. It's like, dude, this is Christmas. It's not Halloween. And so he's like, yeah, but like, understand what I'm saying here. Like, ultimately, my dad found me these little creatures that are ultimately called gremlins, and ultimately, what happened was one of them jumped into this pool, and now there's going to be thousands, if not more, of these gremlins all around town wreaking havoc. And so, reasonably, uh, Billy is telling them this, and he's going to show them Gizmo, and eventually he does. And so, ultimately, they have to dim the lights, and then ultimately they're going to look at Gizmo, and they're like, you know what, this isn't actually so bad, and this and that. But yeah, then all of a sudden the sheriff starts getting calls from everybody in town, seemingly, and he's like, "Whoa!" Like, evidently there was a lot of accidents going on, like in these homes, and yeah, like this is like I guess there's something going on with a bunch of accidents going on, and ultimately Billy is convincing them. It's like, no, the Gremlins are trying as much as possible to make these deaths look like accidents, but it's not an accident. So the sheriff and the deputy go throughout town. I think Billy ends up kind of going about his own way to eventually retrieve Kate, because this is we're kind of cementing that Billy and Kate, girlfriend, boyfriend, this and that. And anyways, um, let's move on. So we have the deputy and the sheriff just kind of like just driving through town, just like, hey, this is a Christmas, and so all of a sudden we have one Santa Claus like being completely and utterly attacked by all these gremlins all over his body, and the sheriff and the deputy are like looking at him being attacked, and he's like, hey, yeah, like, hey, that's the one neighbor that dresses up as Santa Claus every year. Hey, what's all those things around him? And like the closer and closer Santa's like, hey, sheriff, help me, help me. And so the gremlins are attacking him, and so we have the deputy and the sheriff that are just like, wow, like this is like weird. And so we also have one neighbor who is also getting carolers at her house, or what she thinks is carolers. So somebody keeps knocking at her door, and she's like, oh, I think those are probably carolers. So she's this woman that has to have this chair being electronically helping her up and down these stairs, because she can't actually walk up flights of stairs. So she ultimately opens the door and realizes it's not normal carolers, it's gremlin characters who are singing a variation of their own song. And she ultimately freaks out, closes the door, and ultimately the gremlins are trying to make it into the house. So she gets back into her chair to try to make it back upstairs, and the chair that is attached to the flight of stairs malfunctions and starts crazily going way faster than it should, and then shoots her out of this window, and that kills her off. Ultimately, it seems like the gremlins are messing up a lot of electronics bizarrely, as if they know how to do electronical like stuff. And so at one point, one of the gremlins is messing with one of the lights, one of the traffic lights, for the traffic lights to go like green, blue, yellow, blue, red, blue, green, yellow, all this, and like crazily like starting car accidents and this and that. So eventually we have to showcase Kate being at this bar, and it's a bar filled with gremlins. Ultimately, there's one gremlin that tries to flash Kate bizarrely, but there's a lot of other gremlins that are desperately, hey, I want another drink, and Kate is giving them whatever they want as long as they don't bite her. So you just see a slew of like gremlins that are all doing different things. They're either playing poker or they're like, there's one gremlin that was bizarrely like doing like puppets, which I think was kind of some kind of inner joke going on. I think there was one gremlin that looked like very much noir-esque. There was one gremlin that was dancing. There's a number of different kind of gremlins going on in this bar simultaneously. There's a lot of stuff to talk about, but mood point. So there's also like one gremlin that's held on to the fan and flying around. It looks pretty funny. So, anyways, going into this, Kate decides that she's like, you know what? I'm probably starting to run out of alcohol to give to all these gremlins, and they just won't stop eating to the point where ultimately, if they run out of beer, they will probably run into me. So ultimately, what Kate decides to do is she has a Polaroid like camera, one of those cameras where you can easily have the film shoot out and you can kind of wipe, you can kind of like wiggle it around until it like shows, and then you're like, oh yeah, like kind of an old camera. I don't think those exist nowadays because generations. So Kate ultimately starts flashing this camera in front of all of these gremlins' eyes, and of course, since they hate bright light, ultimately they scatter. And so Kate keeps using this camera to ultimately try to evade all these gremlins. There is at one point this like robber Ash looking ski mask guy with a gremlin with a gun, and that was kind of funny. But ultimately, like Kate was trying to dodge the bullets coming at her. So we get to the point in this movie to where ultimately Billy comes driving in with his highest high beams with his car, and so eventually the stupid thing is that um, is that Billy and Kate end up going into this car, but then the car ends up not working. So Billy and Kate say, okay, well, I think now we need to make a run for it. So they start making a run for it, and there's these gremlins that keep popping out. And ultimately, Kate slams a trunk on one of them. And so, anyways, so they eventually make it to this movie theater. And they realize that there seems to be a ton of gremlins all going to this movie theater. And so they're all going to the movie theater seeing Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs because reasons. And so recently, I guess the reason why you have this song going on is probably because that's the only song that the gremlins could easily sound like they're singing, and it not having to be like them having to actually learn any kind of words. But it seems like the Gremlins were slowly but surely at some point learning words and stuff like that. But it was very slow and but I think like the sequel, I think you have one Gremlin that seems to have like a very much dialect and could actually talk at some point. But anyways, that is what it is. So in this movie, you very much have gremlins, and they are all in the movie, all like, yeah, having a good time. They're hi hoing. And so, reasonably, Billy realizes that a bulk of all the gremlins are all in this movie theater. So, he is thinking, you know what? Here's the best way to wipe all of these out is by like having a bulk of them all in one room. So, what Billy ends up doing is he ends up finding the gas line, and he ends up pulling the gas, and ultimately he's um, telling Kate, and he's telling his gizmo to ultimately, hey, like, try not to breathe in this gas. Ultimately, I completely forgot to mention what happens to the dog in this movie because I don't want to mention what happens with the dog in this movie because it's not that bad. Like the dog doesn't get killed, but I just don't want to mention it. It's just mood point. I don't want to mention what happened to the dog. So ultimately, a lot of people are like, well, why didn't you mention what happened to the dog? Because I don't want to mention what happened to the dog, even though he didn't get killed. Good enough for him. I just don't want to mention it. But anyways, there's a lot of stuff that I'm probably ramming through and trying to get done at this point. because there's a lot of stuff to still talk about. So, anyways, we have Billy gasline, and then ultimately what he ends up doing is he tries to close the theater up so that way the gremlins don't get out, and so um, he ends up going and lighting lighting up this like paper towel ish like thing to get a flame to go into the theater so this theater can blow up. One thing that I didn't mention was ultimately during the movie, I think the leader Stripe, ultimately he went and got and tried to desperately get more candy because evidently they ran out. So ultimately, the gremlin walks to a store, a convenience store that ultimately has candy, and ultimately will get back to Stripe. So ultimately, Billy and Kate are watching this theater blow up. And it seems like every single gremlin must have been in this theater, you'd have to assume, even though it probably doesn't really quite commingle in my mind that that's what all magically happened. But I guess they probably could have figured out a numerous way to beat this thing. So when looking at it, somebody would have been able to just beat it anyways. So, anyways, we have Billy and Kate that are noticing that Stripe is making his way out of a store, and so immediately they're like, "Oh my God, he's the last one left." And Stripe notices this that they're after him, and so he ultimately skedaddles into the store for Billy to go through the store and look for him. So Billy ends up looking for him, and Stripe from time to time keeps poking his head out of somewhere. Um, Oh man, I forgot about some of the attacks that I forgot about the mom. Like the one gremlin coming out of the tree, or like there's some other kind of attacks that happen. Um, but oh well, mood point. There's too much going on in this movie. At some point, there's probably stuff I will forget. But yeah, there was a gremlin that came out of the tree that attacked the mother. But then there was also like another gremlin that was going to also attack her as well. But at the end of the day, um, Billy saves the day. So all things are copacetic and this and that and whatever, what have you. So everything is completely fine. Billy's mom is fine at the end of the day. So Billy ends up going to the convenience store trying to find Stripe because ultimately he's realizing if Stripe finds water, this is going to start all over again. And so reasonably, Billy is going through the convenience store, and at one point of the store, there were TVs. All of a sudden, Stripe is all over these TVs, and Billy, because he had gotten scared, breaks one of the TVs, and then all the other TVs light up with it being Stripe. So, eventually, getting to a point here, Stripe ends up going and trying to attack Billy with a chainsaw, a small chainsaw. And so Billy ends up grabbing a baseball bat because he ends up getting smashed with all this like sports supplies. So he ends up grabbing a baseball bat, and the gremlin is trying as much as possible to chainsaw through this bat. But Billy eventually gets the upper hand, pushes Stripe back. So it gets to the point to where Stripe is running to ultimately try to find some water source. And so eventually he is going through this like greenhouse like area to find a fountain. So what ends up happening is Gizmo is also like driving around this convenience store and kind of having some fun. But then eventually he is realizing that there is bright light somewhere, and so um, he is pulling levers somewhere to start opening up some bright lights for Stripe to get hurt. So Billy is very much looking at Stripe, ultimately about to do what Gizmo did when water was around him. He's starting to almost get other gremlins. But what ends up happening is the bright light ends up coming in. So like bright light mixed with water, I guess, is a mess of just deadliness to where it is almost turning the gremlins into being dipped into acid to the point to where the gremlins, like, man, to see him is just like, man, this looks kind of ugly. And the thing that kind of like surprised me a little bit was when like Billy thinks that everything is like done, and so eventually he goes close to the fountain, and then the gremlin like pops up again as mostly a skeleton for one last scare, and then ultimately the skeleton ends up dying and falling over. So yeah, one little thing that like I wasn't expecting, because I'm like, I don't remember like probably a good decent bulk of this movie. I don't remember anything about it. I don't remember anything about it. It's been so long since seeing it, and then on top of that, it's just like I don't remember this film. So, anyways, I yeah, so that is how the last Gremlin, supposedly from who knows, gets resolved. So it ends up that everybody is so happy and they're so proud that they finally defeat this thing. And ideally, we have uh, the guy from Japan who has to make his journey all the way back or all the way to America to recollect Gizmo. And so we have it to where he tells this inventor that it's like, yeah, you weren't ready to have this, so you aren't gonna have it. Like, if anything, if you were much more prepared, then if anything, because this guy randomly checks upon if this thing was taken care of, and then if not, he recollects it, I guess. Weird. So ultimately, the inventor feels so bad because he was off the entire time at some like expo where they have all these kind of random characters that you know from any number of TV shows. Like the Time Machine is in the background. You have the Lost in Space Will Robinson robot in the background. All these like random esh like things going on in this one scene of Billy's father being at some convention and not at home. And so eventually, once Billy's father comes back from this convention, ultimately to realize what all had happened, and so then he's just there to see this previous owner of Gizmo collect him back. And so, reasonably, Billy is just like, yeah, you know what? Like, I don't think I'm ready for Gizmo yet. I don't think I'm ready. So, and plus, after all that ruckus, like, that I created, after doing what I did, like, maybe we'll just, like, say, hey, see you later, Gizmo. And so, ultimately, Gizmo had grown to be a very good friend with Billy, and so ultimately, Gizmo wanted to say one last thing to Billy, and so the previous owner, I guess, can learn what Gizmo is saying. So ultimately, he's like, okay, hey, Gizmo wants to say something to you, and then we'll go. They reopen the box back up, and Gizmo says like bye to him, and it's like, ah, such a sweet moment. And but it's like, hey, like, yeah, get this thing out of here, because yeah, they're gonna do some more mistakes, and they're gonna do some they're gonna make some mistakes here. So yeah, so the previous owner uh, takes the gizmo and says, "Hey, maybe one day, when you're ready, like you can take this, but until then, I'm keeping it." And it's like, okay, sure. So it ends with the inventor kind of mentioning like, "Hey, like at any point." like he's starting to narrate off in the distance while basically the like there's a snowy background, and he's mentioning like, well, hey, anytime that any of your like lights go out or electronics don't work, hey, don't call the repairman right away. Maybe you should probably think that a gremlin is in your house. Like that is the one like unsettling thing that they could do at the very end of this whole thing. But anyways, let's get into Vampire Kiss because I've already taken an hour talking about Gremlins, but it was a lot of backstory to get to that point. So, anyways, Vampire's Kiss, which I hope is probably going to be a little bit easier thing to review and not take 2 hours to review it. Ultimately, this movie to me, as I'm off screen here for a second, Vampire Kiss. Ultimately, I enjoy a lot of Nicolas Cage movies, and so ultimately, when just kind of going into Vampire Kiss, I was kind of unexpected about this movie, but I think one day when I went on YouTube and I was looking into like a montage of Nicolas Cage movies where he would just say all these like random esh like things in a number of all of his films. There was one movie that really stuck out to me that I had a really good laugh at watching, and I was like, what the F is this movie? I gotta figure out what it is. So, out of figuring out IMDb's and all this other stuff, I ultimately found out that this movie was Vampire's Kiss. And so I ultimately was like, okay, now I need to see this movie. I need to see this movie in my life because this movie is freaking hilarious. But if anything, like there's probably some stuff about it that probably doesn't hold up, or for a lot of people, it might be a very clunky movie to some people. But at the end of the day, I just want to say it's a film. So that ultimately, when looking at it, it's kind of funny in some approaches. So going into this, we have Peter Lowe, who ultimately is Nicolas Cage's character. Jennifer Beals, who ultimately a lot of people might know, I think from like Flashdance, maybe. I think she plays Rachel in this movie. I could be wrong about that. And she plays the Rachel. She plays the vampire mostly in this movie because there is an actual seemingly vampire that we don't quite know is a vampire or not, or if Nicolas Cage is just losing his mind. So, anyways, reasonably within this movie, it's really a fun film. I had a lot of joking time watching it, especially if this is your first time watching this movie. It's going to be hilarious. If it's not, then maybe it'll eventually wear off on you. But I think for the most part, this movie is going to be funny or very bizarre to a lot of people. But at the end of the day, I would recommend people finding a way to see this. Ultimately, I think Gremlins wasn't an easy, convenient thing for me to figure out where exactly for people to get this at. More than likely, you might go through any movie apps or anything like that. There's not an easy way to recommend this. And Vampire Kiss is like the only place to really rent it is on Vudu. So if you guys don't have a Redbox to finally get these movies or whatever, find some movie app like Source to ultimately watch either one of these movies. At the end of the day, you can just hear what I have to say regardless. So, Vampire's Kiss. So, going into this movie, there is a lot of times where Nicolas Cage looks like he is getting sick, but reasonably, I think he's getting mentally, healthily ill, to the point to where bizarrely he is imagining through how many times that he's been into the throes of bedroom business with people that eventually it's going to get to the point where he is bizarrely going to be attracted by fighting off some bat, and then that journey like changes within his mind to ultimately escalate into not him just finding any regular, or not him getting to his place fighting off any kind of bat, but then fighting off a woman that he finds out is a vampire-ish like person that eventually supposedly sucks his blood and turns him into quite possibly a vampire. but there is no rationality to Nicolas Cage's actual journey. And at some point, you can kind of tell that Nicolas Cage doesn't actually turn into a vampire. He kind of has to try to turn into one himself. And reasonably, a bulk of the time, he is just a loon for most of this movie. Um, but ultimately, it's freaking hilarious. Wait to the points of which I get into spoilers to where ultimately Nicolas Cage starts talking about the freaking alphabet. It's hilarious. A, B, C. I never misspelled anything. Anyways, so yeah, so now we're going to go into. I think we're just going to rush into spoilers about this because at the end of the day, it's a fun movie that ultimately people might feel different ways about. So at the end of the day, let's go into this movie. It's either you go and see it or you don't see it. Like, I recommend probably people do just because it's funny, but when looking at it, it's a movie not for everyone. So at the end of the day, let's review Vampire's Kiss. Let's go into spoilers about this movie. Let's go into the double five time count because at the end of the day, it's yeah. Watch a trailer for this movie. Go and just watch this movie. It's a fairly interesting movie, and it's bizarre. It's funny and bizarre. So at the end of the day, by and large, let's go into this movie. So spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I get to spoil this movie. So Nicolas Cage is seeking out a therapist. And ultimately, the very beginning of this, we have Jack. We have, as many times as I said Nicolas Cage, I should know the name by now. We have Nicolas Cage, ultimately, Peter talking to his therapist, ultimately telling her that he desperately wanted some woman, but once he gets her in her bed, the only thing that he desperately wants is for her to disappear. And so, reasonably, this therapist, it seems that she is just listening to him talking, but it doesn't really feel like she's consistently actually giving him any kind of actual answers for a bulk of this, or it just doesn't really quite feel like she's actually like giving like him any like real true therapy, to be brutally honest. But when looking at it, it's like he doesn't really need therapy because ultimately he's just uh, he doesn't need therapy, or I don't think no therapy is gonna really help this person. Like he needs to get on some medication or something, and this and that. So, anyways, we get it to where Nicolas Cage is going through his like we're gonna kind of really quickly go through a lot of these transitional Esh like moments, and ultimately while going into um, this therapy session, um, or these therapy sessions, we also have Nicolas Cage that is consistently going after women every night, and so ultimately Nicolas Cage has a like meets a woman, brings her home, and ultimately I think her name is Jackie. I could be wrong, and ultimately he brings her home. I think bizarrely, while these people were trying to get to their apartment, they were talking about Marvel characters because when looking at it, Nicolas Cage says something about the Fantastic Four and some other characters. And so reasonably, like, I wonder what game that they were playing while they were kind of leading up to this room. Interesting enough. So going into this room, eventually we have it to where uh, the woman is starting to declothe, so is Nicolas Cage. But then eventually, uh, Nicolas Cage and his girlfriend finds that there's a bat into this bedroom, and so a bat's flying around. Nicolas Cage is trying to shoo it away, and ultimately at the end of the day they end up leaving the apartment to go somewhere else. And so eventually, Nicolas Cage is talking to his therapist and mentioning how when fighting this bat, he had gotten turned on. And so his therapist mentions, it's like, well, that's a really weird like story, but maybe there's a whole scientific reason for all this. Maybe you weren't actually literally turned on while fighting the bat. Maybe you were actually turned on before with the whole throes of passion and and this and that. Like maybe it was like before that whole thing had happened. So eventually Nicolas Cage is like, you know what, maybe you're right. So eventually Nicolas Cage goes to his work and ultimately has it to where he has this I think it's secretary called Alva. Like I want to say Alba, but it's probably Alva. But it sounds like Alba every time that they talk. So it could be Alba. I don't know. But anyways, we have Nicolas Cage that ultimately has Alba, which I that's probably how I'll pronounce it for the rest of this time. Alba coming to his office and tells him, "Hey, there is a contract that ultimately one of our clients needs. Like it's probably under like a rattlesnake like contract, or maybe it's under so it could be under H or it could be under this. It's probably going to take hours to find because it's the very first contract that this person has ever had. So ultimately, like I'm going to have you go and find this contract." Um, so she goes in and she tries to find it. So within this movie, we have Nicolas Cage, Peter Lowe, that is consistently finding more women to ultimately spend time with, ultimately into a bedroom. And so it seems like at some point he is trying to tie himself on still to Jackie, but he's also kind of playing the field. And at some point, because him and Peter and Jackie both go uh, to this like painting esh like museum, and he ultimately tells her, "Hey, I'm gonna go to the I'm gonna go and take a whiz," and she's like, "Okay, sure." He ends up, instead of going to the bathroom, he runs out of the exit and runs out of that museum and never comes back. And so she calls him and he's like, "God, that's a crappy thing that you did, and I'm never hanging out with you again." But then, bizarrely, at some point, Nicolas Cage, I think, calls her back up and desperately wants to hang out with her again, and he apologizes for everything. Um, so, anyways, but we eventually have Nicolas Cage going out on one of his nights to find another woman, and ends up finding this one girl named Rachel. Uh, Ultimately, he's at a bar and he's asking Rachel if she had caught in that joke, and she didn't. So they introduce one another, and eventually we quickly cue them into getting into some bedroom business to quicken up this movie. Ultimately, we find out that Rachel isn't all what she seems, and ultimately, eventually, is on top of Nicolas Cage, but then eventually she gets the fangs out and starts sucking his blood. Ultimately, she's doing it for a very long time, and ultimately, at some point, Nicolas Cage goes, all right, all right, like, all right, like, all right. And so then eventually she stops. It seems like Rachel is a very jealous lover, and basically she thinks Peter is his and only or only hers, not his, only hers. So reasonably, every time Nicolas Cage would call up Jackie and desperately want her back as a date, ultimately he doesn't show up to Jackie's date because Rachel shows up instead, and grabs him into the bedroom again to suck his blood because she is a jealous lover that hates that Peter's character is playing around. So repetitious times when Peter is ultimately thinking he's still with Rachel. Ultimately, he is making tea and bringing it to no one. He is he is having someone come. Uh, he's having someone who is no one come into the shower with him, and at some point he um, he cuts himself shaving, and so ultimately he puts a band-aid onto his neck. But then he is trying to figure out later whether this reason why he consistently has um, a band-aid on his neck is maybe because he has vampire marks on his neck at some point. Anyways, so going into this, we push now to the repetitive times uh, that Peter is getting on Alva's case consistently within this workplace to the point where Alva tries to leave her job or this and that. So let's get into all those. So, reasonably, the approaches of which we'll go into all these might be out of order, so I apologize. So, in the very beginning, we have ultimately Peter getting a call from the guy who is wanting the contract. So ultimately, we have it uh, to where Nicolas Cage or to where Peter asks Alva to come and watch him dance within this phone call, because ultimately this guy is going to be furious that he doesn't have the contract yet. So Peter picks up the phone, and the guy is really nice. He's like, you know what? It's probably severely hard to find this contract. If anything, like, I just like to have it whenever you guys are not busy. But if anything, it's not a big, huge thing that you have to really push, like, to get done right away. Like, hey, man, just have a good day. And so Nicolas Cage is like saying this and that, and then he eventually hangs up. So Nicolas Cage tells Alva, he's like, well, I guess it's lucky for me that I didn't have to do a dance. Because as you can see, when I was talking to him on the phone, I couldn't get a word in edgewise. So he is furious. He is fuming and this and that. You better give me that contract, Alva, or I will fire you. So it gets to the point to where, in the very beginning of this, Nicolas Cage at some point chases Alva into the bathroom. Like, he's chasing her through the entire uh business office into the bathroom, and ultimately he's like, you better get that contract, Alva. You better get this contract. So there's another coworker that sees her, and then ultimately is like, hey, are you okay? And she's like, yeah, I'm fine. So it gets to the point too, again, there's consistently escalations to this, and then eventually Nicolas Cage the next day apologizes that he was on some awful drug. And ultimately, Alva says, yeah, I was on that drug once when I was a kid. And he's like, oh, really? So ultimately Alva mentions that it's like, well, hey, couldn't you get somebody else on this job, or could you get someone to help me do this job? And Nicolas Cage takes his sunglasses down. He's like, you know what, Alva? Your position, you are the newest uh, worker in this company. So your position is the lowest of the low. And so you are gonna have to do the dirtiest jobs, the jobs that no one else wants to do. And ultimately, if there was somebody that wanted to do this job, I would not have them help you do it, because because that's that's who I am, and this and that. Like, If anything, you're going to find that contract. You're going to find that contract or I'm going to fire you. There's this whole escalation to his voice. And he has these like weird eye popping out like thing going on. And it's freaking hilarious when he's going through all this. And ultimately, at some point when Nicolas Cage is talking to the higher up workers about how Nicolas Cage ran her down into the bathroom. One of his coworkers tells Peter Lowe that evidently Alva has a gun, and because ultimately she lives in a bad neighborhood, and so once this whole ramification of Nicolas Cage telling her how low on the totem pole she is in this job and how she's going to do this job until she finds this contract. While she starts to leave, he tells her, "You going to use your gun, Alva? You going to use your gun?" So we have it to where it gets to the point to where Nicolas Cage is slowly but surely losing his mind. Just losing his mind. And so reasonably there are times when he's just kind of out in places and all of a sudden he is almost trying to vomit at some point, which is weird, but he's trying to like he's really getting sick and there's people that are right next to him going, "Oh, hey buddy, you okay?" And he's like, "Whoa!" It's like, and they're like, "Whoa," like, whoa, what's going on here?" So going into this, Nicolas Cage eventually gets to the point to where he goes to his therapist to ridicule how ultimately they cannot find this contract yet. And he mentions how honestly it should be very easy to find said contract because if anything, like it should either be under H or it should be under B or something like that. And it's like, shouldn't it not be that hard to find this contract out of these things? And so his therapist goes, "Well, yeah, but maybe they had mislabeled something. Maybe they had misfiled something. Mistakes can happen." And so Nicolas Cage goes off and he's just like, "Misfiled? Misfiled. How can you not understand the alphabet?" And then he starts rattling off A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And she's like, "Yeah, okay, I get it. You could say the alphabet and you can spell really well." And like Nicolas Cage is like, "I've never misspelled anything." "I've never misspelled anything." And she's like, "Okay, all right. Like maybe you're right. Maybe like mistakes shouldn't be happening, but evidently you just can't find this file." And so that's driving Nicolas Cage even more to just like, "I want this file found." So we have it to where Nicolas Cage is at work and Alva is not. So immediately Nicolas Cage, Peter Lowe's character, is calling to ultimately ask where Alva is, and ultimately Alva had taken a sick day. So he goes all the way with a taxi cab to find Alba to get her soup and to ultimately apologize and say, "Hey, yeah, you know what? I am really, really sorry of what all I did." Because before this, Alva is sick at home. Well, supposedly sick at home, but really she's saying how bad her job is. And her mother is saying, "Well, yeah, like my job is bad too, but ultimately I keep doing it because I just keep doing it." Alva's mentioning how she says like, "No, you don't realize how bad this boss is." And so reasonably eventually her mother goes to work and then because her mother is telling her the rest of her family that like, yeah, she's supposedly sick, she hates this job and whatever. So And we ultimately know that her brother is some kind of mechanic somewhere because he keeps popping in and out at some points in time. So we ultimately have, like I said, Peter Lowe going all the way to Alva's home. And ultimately, like, he's telling her, it's like, you know what? Hey, if this guy, like, gets so frustrated that he doesn't sign with us anymore, then that's fine. Like, everything is fine, Alba. Like, believe me, like, I am really sorry. Like, he is trying to butter her up to tell her every single thing is gonna be okay. And so Alva's like, well, you know what? I am not actually sick. The reason why I didn't come into work today is because I knew I probably wouldn't find this contract. And so, like, again, Peter Lowe was just like, that's fine, Alva. Like, I get it. Like, I get that the job is hard. And so, yeah, if you want to just come with me back to work, we'll just forget about the contract. Everything's going to be okay. And so, Alva comes with Peter Lowe to get back into the taxi, and Peter Lowe gets sick again, and then ultimately he changes again. He changes his personality again. So Alva is in the taxi, and Peter is mentioning how expensive that he had to drive all the way here with his taxi to get her, and now that she's going to come to work, this is going to be the perfect time for her to finally find this contract because she needs to find the contract. And so Alpha is just like, well, I thought that you said, he's like, yeah, like you're going to find the contract today. So why? And so Alva is just so swindled by ultimately having her boss get to her and think that everything's going to be okay, but she's going to go right back to trying to find this contract and right back to the same work environment that she hates. So it ends up being, while Nicolas Cage is crazily going off, Alva is stopping at one point to ultimately go to her brother to ultimately desperately want to finally get bullets for her gun that she has. And so ultimately, her brother is mentioning, like, hey man, like, this, like, we don't have any real bullets for this gun. All we have is blanks. And she's like, well, give me the blanks. Like, at least I can scare him off or something. Because this guy is crazy. Because he's just like, he's like, I'm really like afraid of him. And so his brother gives her the blinks. She goes on her way back to work. And so what ends up happening is that we have it to where Alva is scrambling eventually through trying to find this contract. And so ultimately, while that is going on, Rachel is inside Nicolas Cage's office, again, sucking the blood out of him. And so it ends up that Alva finally finds this contract after all of this time and brings it to Peter Lowe. And she's like, oh my god, I found the contract. Can you believe it? I found it. And Peter Lowe says, well, Alba, I hate to break it to you, but it's too late. It's too late, Alba. It's too late. And she's like, no, it's not too late. The contract's right here. And he's like, no, Alba, it's too late. And so, again, we have Alva running off. Nicolas Cage is running after her. It's too late, Alva. It's too late. And so it gets to the point where Alva is backed into some corner in some part of this building, and so she takes out her gun and is pointing at Nicolas Cage, knowing full well the bullets are blanks. And Nicolas Cage is getting closer and closer to her and telling her to shoot him. And so she's shooting at the ground, she's shooting everywhere else to try to scare him off. And he's like, no, shoot me, shoot at me, shoot me. And so she doesn't, and instead he grabs her and he does some adult content ish like things that I can't mention because I'm trying to clean a review up as much as possible. So he does a little bit of something, but then he imagines or fantasizes that it's Rachel again, and she is like mentioning um, that he's her lover, and then eventually it goes right back to being Alva. And so Peter eventually takes the gun and tries to have it go off in his mouth, and eventually uh, it does nothing. And so ultimately he can't take himself out. He can't hurt himself. Ultimately, at some point, he goes in the bathroom and looks at his reflection, and his reflection is completely fine. But every time Nicolas Cage is looking at his reflection, he is saying that, "Oh my God, I'm not there. Where am I?" And he's repetitiously saying, "Where am I?" To the point where somebody in the bathroom stall is like, "You're in the bathroom, you schmuck." Like, if anything, uh, like grow yourself some cojones or go into the girls room, the girls bathroom. So like that part, like I didn't remember, and I thought that was pretty hilarious. So where am I? You're in the men's bathroom. Freaking I'm trying to drop a deuce here. Go to the women's bathroom if you haven't grown your grapefruits yet or whatever. Anyway, so this movie gets really, really funny. So, anyways, it is what it is. So, ultimately, it ends up that Alva ends up going home and just consistently, repetitiously just sleeping. To where ultimately, her brother gets very concerned, and he's like, "Well, hey, why is she sleeping all the time?" And like the mother says nothing, and so Alva eventually confesses what happened to her brother because she grabs onto him and hugs him, and he's like, "What's wrong, baby? What's wrong?" And so ultimately, Alva tells him, and so this guy is eventually going to go on a rampage to go after Peter Lowe. All the while this is going on, we have Nicolas Cage finally relenting that he's a vampire. He's a vampire. He's a vampire. He's screaming it all over the woods and trees and forests and everywhere he's going. He's screaming out loud that he's a vampire. He goes into some store to buy fake vampire teeth. At first, he tries to go and buy some vampire teeth that are like fiberglass, but they're too expensive. So ultimately, he goes and buys these plastic vampire teeth to put in his mouth that look awful, but it looks hilarious. So Nicolas Cage goes into this disco and ultimately ends up trying to eventually find somebody at this disco, some woman. Eventually, he ends up sitting next to a woman that is seemingly drunk. It seems like Nicolas Cage goes into this disco via force because ultimately there's some guy that is stopping him from getting in the club, and he punches this guy in the face to ultimately go onto this disco. So Nicolas Cage is going through this club, and eventually he finds some very drunk girl that doesn't know any better, and so ultimately he goes and starts talking to her, and he has his eyes as wide as can be, and like he looks so goofy, and at some points you could see the vampire teeth protruding out of his mouth a lot of times. So anyways, like ultimately we have what it seems like Nicolas Cage making out with this girl at first, but then eventually he bites her as much as he can, and ultimately uh, he stops biting her, and then eventually you could just see all this blood all over his dress clothes. So eventually he ends up finding Rachel that had supposedly summoned him as a vampire, and ultimately this Rachel supposedly is different. She doesn't know who he is, and ultimately this Rachel has some boyfriend, evidently a new protege. And so ultimately at the end of the day, he is basically grabbing her and telling her like you're my Rachel and everything like that, and like what did you do to me, and all this other stuff, to the point where they end up having to escalate Nicolas Cage out of this club. But then eventually Rachel and her boyfriend are looking at him like like oh yeah. So eventually we get to some point to where Nicolas Cage is rummaging through the streets, ultimately hallucinating and saying nothing that makes no sense. Consistently telling people that he's a vampire and no one believes him. At some point, he ends up is just strolling through the street, and he is ultimately grabbing off of some wood pallets, some piece of wood, to ultimately try and at first um, like stab himself with a wooden stake, but he's just like, you know what, I can't do it. So really, he's just walking around town just with a stake in his hand, and then all of a sudden, at some point, he calls his therapist to tell her that he desperately needs a session, and so ultimately she's mentioning all these days, and he's like sooner, and then ultimately she mentions another. He's like sooner, and so ultimately, she like is asking, is this a real like emergency or what's going on? So, because eventually at some point when he has a session with her, ultimately he kind of when she asks him eventually what had happened, uh, like let's regurgitate back what happened to you with that bat. And ultimately Nicolas Cage plays it off as like, well, no, maybe I was a little aroused from being with that woman, and ultimately maybe it was just the whole I was a little drunk and this and that. And so anyways, uh going back to now, Nicolas Cage is walking around town hallucinating, and basically he's walking around town bloodied up with a wooden stake um, in his hand, and the sunrise is starting to happen, or it's starting to become sunrise, and eventually he is hearing church bells, and he's like, "Oh, the madness!" So he's walking through town, ultimately going to his therapy session, and in his mind he is, but realistically he's just walking through town, um, like repeating what he's saying at this hallucination therapy session. So within this mental therapy session, he is talking to his doctor and mentioning, he's like, you know what, your treatment isn't helping me. Like, I don't think that I need your treatment anymore. If anything, what I actually think I need is a woman. And ultimately, the doctor goes, you know what? You're perfectly right. You know what? I have a person that actually comes right after you do. And you know what? She says the exact same things that you do. Isn't that a coincidence? Like, it seems like you two would just be perfect for one another. And so ultimately, the therapist brings in this woman that is ultimately supposedly perfect for Nicolas Cage. And so basically, Nicolas Cage, of course, with his hallucination, is also telling the therapist, hey, you know what? Um, it seems like me and this girl are perfect for one another. It seems like they have the same common interest. Nicolas Cage tells his therapist, "Hey, you know what? I might have actually killed somebody at a club, and like I'm going to confess this to you now." Ultimately, the therapist says, like, "You know what? Hey, like, if anything, like, people die all the time. Like, everything is perfectly fine. It's like, hey, don't be worried about a dead body right now. If anything, just you and this girl go off together because this is a hallucination and nothing makes sense." So it ends up that supposedly them are magically going off together into Nicolas Cage's um, hotel room. And ultimately what ends up happening in Nicolas Cage's mind, which ultimately doesn't actually play off in his hallucination, because at some point the hallucination stops, but the scene keeps going on in Nicolas Cage's head. Ultimately, Nicolas Cage tells his woman that that you know what, maybe now that they're in this life, that maybe that they aren't perfect for one another, and ultimately he starts heckling her and ultimately telling that she might not be the one for him and this and that. So that hallucination bizarrely resolves itself for a reason that doesn't make any sense. But then eventually what happens is the light is coming in upon Nicolas Cage's apartment. So what he ends up doing is he ends up uh, placing down a bed sheet and pillow, but he ends up taking his couch and rotating like to where a normal couch would be set up. He has it to where the couch is kind of flipped over to where ultimately the couch is shielding, like he's sleeping underneath the couch, and the couch is shielding him from the sunlight. So eventually, at some point, Nicolas Cage wakes up because there is the guy that busts into his apartment. That is Alva's brother. Alva's brother comes into this guy's apartment. Nicolas Cage wakes up, and ultimately Nicolas Cage is telling this guy, Al's brother, to do him in, because ultimately he says that he's a vampire and he needs to be killed. Ultimately, Nicolas Cage is setting up the wood piece for Alva's brother to drive it into his chest, and so Alva's brother does so. And then so Nicolas Cage eventually just does die, and that is how this movie eventually just concludes. So a very weird and odd movie, but at the end of the day, I didn't want to take too much time to take 12 hours to try to review this. So I'm gonna get out of here. A really odd and funny movie, but at the end of the day, I apologize for how long all of this took. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.